Hello, hello. Welcome back to a new season of Plan C, Ocean Interventions to Address Climate Change. As always, I'm your host, Anna Madlener, and I'm the MRV manager at the Carbon to Sea initiative. And I'm joined by my co-host, Will Burns, who is the co-executive director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. Hi, Will.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am well. So a lot's changed since we wrapped up last season. We have a new co-sponsor for the pod, Carbon to Sea, and you have a new position with Carbon to Sea. So tell us a little bit more about the new gig.
Yeah, indeed. I am very excited about all of it. And I think during our last few episodes, I was already a fellow exploring MRV at Carbon to Sea. But as of June, I've been the manager for all of the MRV-related programs. For those who don't know what Carbon to Sea is, we are a nonprofit climate science funder who is designed to unlock the ocean's potential to mitigate climate change. We do this by advancing R&D for promising ocean-based carbon dioxide removal methods and accelerating high-integrity solutions through community, market, and policy development. And as of this episode, Carbon to Sea is funding and officially co-producing the podcast with you at the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, it's really great to have Carbon to Sea on board, and I look forward to this season. And so with that segue, what do we have on tap for today?
Yeah, I'm excited about this one. A lot has happened since we together kicked off this podcast 2 years ago. The market has advanced in the context of marine-based carbon removal. The science has advanced. Suppliers have grown, and some of those have also disappeared. There's also been a number of recent reports questioning the integrity of many projects issuing credits in the market generally. And our guests today represent Isometric, which denominates itself as a carbon credit certification platform with a mission to rebuild trust in carbon markets. Indeed, Isometric is a new type of carbon removal registry, so that means they have a buyer pays business model. And without getting into sort of the history of the legacy carbon market, that is new. Isometric certifies as well as issues the resulting credits from the supplier's activity, and the company issues these credits against the protocol its scientists have developed in-house for specific CDR approaches such as enhanced rock weathering and the focus of today's discussion, ocean alkalinity enhancement. And other registries like Puro, for example, denominate this type of document a methodology, but structurally speaking, it's the same. It outlines how the supplier should monitor and report their activities and how a registry verifies those claims. Importantly, all of this takes place in the voluntary carbon market, and none of these actors are structurally or legally required to work with one another. And this is one of the biggest challenges of the voluntary carbon market. And besides Isometric, there are only very few other registries that even issue removal credits as opposed to offsetting credits, for example. So Isometric has a crucial role to play in the marketplace in marine carbon removal, and it's no small feat.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And in general, in the carbon removal realm, having high integrity MRV is going to be critical in terms of sending the kind of market signals that investors will need. And it's going to be critical if ultimately governments establish these kind of standards. And so I think Isometric potentially has a role to play in helping to create those models. So it'll be very interesting to hear their take and their evolution.
I think so too. And for those who don't know, MRV stands for Monitoring, Reporting, and Verification. And yeah, I'm excited to share with the world what I personally have behind the curtain seen to be a really good overview of where the science in ocean alkalinity enhancement is at, the genuine minds behind it, and the process they intend to adhere to continuously improve it over time as well.
Great. And so who's going to join us today?
Right. We will be joined by Sophie Gill, who is the Marine Carbon Removal Manager at Isometric and holds a PhD in Earth Sciences. Secondly, we will hear from Jing He, who is a carbon removal scientist with a PhD in physical oceanography, as well as thirdly, Jennifer Yin, also a carbon removal scientist and holding a PhD in environmental fluid dynamics. Shall we jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Hi, everyone. How's it going?
Very well, thank you. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks. So we have three guests today. You'll hear from each and every one of them in a little bit. Thank you all for being here. We're excited. Sophie, to kick this off, take us on a journey through Isometric's creation and existence, as well as its purpose in the carbon market world.
Sure. So at Isometric, we're on a mission to ensure that we rebuild trust in carbon markets. And we think that's essential for carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, to scale to the level the planet needs. We were founded in 2022, and we're a registry for high quality carbon removal. But what does that mean? So being a registry means that we issue carbon credits where one credit equals at least 1 ton of CO2 removed from the atmosphere. And high quality carbon removal means only issuing credits that are highly transparent and come from a science-first basis, which is not always how things have been done in previous legacy carbon markets. And we write protocols for monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV. And those prescribe a high bar for suppliers looking to do carbon removal and supply carbon credits to adhere to when they carry out their projects. And those protocols are written according to a high-level isometric standard, which covers our core principles and lists the requirements that ensure delivered tons have measurable climate impact. And just to give a bit of a sense of what those kind of core principles consist of, so tons must be durable, additional, and calculated using the latest scientific techniques. And those tons must also include a scientifically robust uncertainty quantification. So just to make it clear, so the MRV protocols then sit a level underneath that overarching high-level isometric standard and are written for each carbon removal pathway to give more detailed and prescriptive information on how the isometric standard should be upheld. So in practice, how do you do the uncertainty quantification for a particular carbon removal pathway? And when I say carbon removal pathway, I mean something like ocean alkalinity enhancement, or OAE, or direct air capture, DAC, because we at Isometric, I guess today we're going to talk primarily about the work that we do in the marine team here, but we do actually cover a broader range of carbon removal techniques, spanning terrestrial approaches too.
So maybe drill down a bit on that. What do you think are the fundamental elements that make an isometric sort of standard different, right? Because we've seen lots of issues, right, in the legacy carbon markets, and so lots of mistrust, right? What are you doing that's different?
Yeah, great question. I'll take that. I'm Jing. So I'd say the main ways that Isometric differentiates ourselves is one, financial incentive alignment, two, really emphasizing scientific rigor, and then three, a focus on transparency. So starting with financial incentive alignment, traditionally, registries have been paid by the suppliers of carbon credits, and the payment is per credit issued. So obviously, this incentivizes registries to have a lower quality bar, because then that allows you to issue as many credits as possible and you can make the most amount of money. But in contrast, Isometric has a different business model. So we're paid by buyers of carbon credits. And this better helps align incentives, because the buyers are the ones who want to make sure that what they're paying for is actually real. And then also our verification fee is fixed at the beginning of the project, so it's not dependent on how many credits actually get verified and issued at the end. So this is really important to make sure that we're not incentivized to overissue credits. Moving on to scientific rigor. So our job on the science team here is to develop scientifically rigorous protocols and issue credits based on verifying projects against those protocols. And the way we think about this is, instead of copying the way things have been done before, which will, as you've alluded to, has led to a lot of issues in the legacy carbon markets, we try to always use first principles thinking in the scientific method in the way that we work. And that sort of brings us to transparency. So we're ultimately really hoping to bring a whole new level of transparency to the carbon removal market. And this is actually a really key part of scientific rigor. So we want to make sure that you don't just take our word that a credit has been accurately verified, but on our registry, we want to be able to transparently show all the data that went into the carbon removal calculations, so that you can go on there and then check for yourself, like look at the data, analyze it yourself. We also see transparency as referring to just being honest about what is known and not yet known and needs further scientific research. And that's also a really important part of building trust.
Yeah, it's really helpful and I think extremely important to highlight. And I wonder if we can couple that a little bit with your first point about what Isometric does, Sophie, and dive a little deeper into the terminology, just so we set the stage properly for the rest of the episode. For those who maybe aren't so deep in the weeds, there's words thrown around. We have protocols, we have standards, we have methodologies, which people may have heard about. Can you explain better, what the role is of a standard versus a protocol or a methodology, how that works in sort of the system of a carbon crediting and issuance, as well as sort of who sets those rules and who determines what is a good protocol and therefore sort of aligns with that transparency that Jing alluded to. How do those two things go together?
That's a great question. So I will do my best to outline. I would definitely agree with you that these pieces of terminology are used like relatively inconsistently across the carbon removal market right now. So I think I can probably provide some reflections on how they're used right now and then how we use those words to like provide some clarity. So a standard, as we would describe it, is like, as I kind of outlined to begin with, like this higher level, like core principles of how a registry should conduct themselves. And people might refer to a standard as meaning what we would refer to as a protocol, which is like a project level document that prescribes like exactly how like measurements or models should be carried out for a particular carbon removal approach. So that's like how people might use those a little differently. But the standard that we have developed, which is like this high level overarching set of principles, for us, we're aligned to the ICVCM. So like this kind of voluntary body that governs what's going on in the voluntary carbon removal markets right now in the absence of regulation. And we're also ICROA aligned. So that's kind of how we would align with like authorities who are kind of working within the VCM. In terms of how people use the word methodology, so in some ways, I think other registries would refer to what we have written as protocols as a methodology. So those are functionally equivalent, really, but we refer to them as protocols because we would say that a protocol seems to us like a more scientifically robust way to describe what it is we're trying to do, which is like set out these step-by-step guidelines of how suppliers should adhere to MRV. And I guess that's how I would summarize the way that we use those pieces of terminology. Hopefully that makes it clear, but happy to answer more questions if there are particular points you wanted to draw out, Anna.
Yeah, I was wondering if you want, that's great. That's definitely what I wanted to get at. And I wondered if you want to add just a tiny information before we get into the detail of who decides what a good protocol is, right? So there's the isometric level standard for your own protocol, right? And then there's standards across the industry, I suppose, which registries should adhere to. But can you just allude to that for a moment and then we'll dive a bit deeper?
Sure. So the factors in the voluntary carbon market right now, and I think this is something really important to bear in mind, like there aren't kind of legal obligations to work towards a particular bar, and that's why we've seen problems in the kind of legacy carbon markets. And that's why it's so important for an actor like Isometric to come along looking to do things in a different way where we can align incentives as far as possible and set this like high bar, which we can write our protocols according to.
Great. So let's dive a little bit into the ocean aspect. Jen, the OAE protocol was certified at the end of May, and you actually also just released the electrolytic seawater mineralization protocol for public consultation. While we'll talk in depth about the OAE protocol, the ESM one obviously is also ocean related. So broadly, can you tell us a bit about what these protocols cover and what they don't?
Sure. So our protocols detail how net CO2 removal must be quantified, and this includes requirements around the project operations, durable storage, monitoring, data collection, and reporting. One way to think about the protocol is like a recipe. So it details the ingredients and steps to follow, but it doesn't go into the details of exactly how that project should be implemented. That is to account for flexibility across different project and site specifics. And those details are included in a project design document, or PDD, which is generated by the project developer. Protocols are publicly available on our website. Thank you for pointing out the OAE and ESM ones. And I definitely encourage listeners out there to check them out. One thing to highlight with our protocols is that we build them in a modular way. So aspects of the CDR process that are similar across pathways are treated consistently. So we have modules for emissions accounting, feedstock characterization, capture processes like air-sea gas exchange in the marine space, and storage. So, for example, in our marine protocols, in OAE, we have an air-sea gas exchange module, and we also have a dissolved inorganic carbon storage module, which is used in both OAE and ESM. In terms of the two protocols specifically, we have requirements around project applicability. So this is to ensure consistency in determining the system boundary around those projects and drawing a minimum bar for responsible deployment in regard to environmental and social safeguards. So for the OAE protocol, this is broadly applicable to projects which add alkalinity to the ocean from coastal outfalls using mineral approaches such as from planetary or electrochemical approaches. And for those who aren't familiar with electrolytic seawater mineralization, this is a CDR pathway that uses electrolysis to split seawater into an acidic and alkaline stream while co-producing hydrogen. The two streams are processed separately, where the alkaline stream is reacted with atmospheric CO2 to facilitate carbon uptake, and the acidic stream is reacted with alkaline feedstock to neutralize the acidity. These streams are recombined and neutralized before being discharged to the ocean. And it's a technology that's being pioneered by Aquatic. Electrolytic seawater mineralization shares many of the steps associated with OAE, and it also harnesses the inherent storage capacity of the ocean, but it's different in that the CO2 uptake occurs within a reactor instead of the open ocean.
Great. So if we can sort of simplify and visualize a little bit, these are like two separate documents, and sort of the storage of dissolved inorganic carbon module is both in the OAE one and in the ESM one, but the air-sea gas exchange is not? Or how would you sort of visualize what this process looks like for those who maybe haven't spent the time exploring both documents? Yeah,
that's correct. So the dissolved inorganic carbon storage is used in both protocols. The air-sea gas exchange module would only be applicable for OAE. We are also in the preliminary stages of drafting a direct ocean capture protocol, and so the air-sea gas exchange module would be applicable there.
Would be in there.
Yeah. And then emissions accounting and feedstock characterization are also consistently used in both protocols.
Great. Yeah, I think this is a very interesting example that shows marine carbon removal is so many complicated individual different things. And maybe you can actually allude to this a little bit in the next question, because I think I remember that the OAE protocol used to be sort of more general than it eventually was, which was just the coastal outfall OAE protocol. And before we sort of go into the process of this, I just want to highlight a little bit that all of this is new, right? And all of this is novel and hasn't really been done before for carbon removal pathways, in part because there is no sort of larger standard consensus or clarity around how CDR should be done or should be verified and monitored and measured and reported, etc. So in light of that immense challenge and difficulty, can you take us on the journey and how you got to this OAE protocol? Most of the listeners were probably not involved in your extensive sort of community engagement process, but I was in some stages, so I'd love for you to sort of outline, maybe not step by step, but outline sort of what it took, what were the challenges of sort of finding consensus on, even finding a literature consensus on what a protocol for OAE would look like. And we'll keep it to OAE from now on.
Yeah, I can describe that. So it was not a short or easy process. We first started thinking about an OAE protocol, I think, in September of last year. And we definitely felt some initial trepidation about even doing this, because just as ocean scientists ourselves, we felt a really deep responsibility as first movers to really do it right. And we definitely wanted to make sure to not create the protocol in isolation, but to try to bring the community along with us for the journey, for this, first marine CDR protocol. So yeah, this started before any drafting actually occurred. We had a lot of conversations with folks working in the space, such as OAE project developers, monitoring and modeling service providers, NGOs, to get some initial feedback on our thinking and to scope the protocol. The bulk of the drafting was done by our internal isometric science team, where we have 4 wonderful ocean scientists to contribute, but also because a protocol is such an interdisciplinary document, we also have colleagues with other expertise to help out with alkaline feedstock sourcing and characterization, system boundaries and life cycle analysis, etc. And then our principle throughout the creation of the protocol was to just make sure we're getting a lot of feedback at every step along the way. So not just at the end when we have a finished product. So once we had a very first rough draft that still had some open questions, we had a round of expert review where we had 7 academics, or some of the leaders of current OAE research, read over the draft, provide their feedback, and we had a call with them to try to find some consensus among the group about some challenging topics. Some of these people have been on this podcast before. I believe Leonard Bach was here recently, and Matt Long from Seaworthy has been a previous guest. So we've been really grateful for all of their inputs to the protocol and to make sure that it's reflective of the best available science. Then we also took advantage of the Ocean Sciences meeting that happened in New Orleans earlier this year in February, where we held a community consensus building workshop for the OAE protocol. And I wish we were able to have more, but we had a limited capacity in space. So we had over 50 people attend that workshop representing all different sectors of the MCDR space. So academia, industry, NGOs, government, CDR buyers. Carbon to Sea was there. So, Anna, we were really glad to have you. And all in all, we received over 1,000 comments on the protocol, which we've been super happy about. And we consider it a huge success to really see so much engagement. One of the biggest challenges definitely was just, how do you make good decisions when there is still a lack of consensus in this early stage? So, for example, we would get some feedback saying that, oh, you need many more measurements. Well, we might also get other feedback saying, why are you requiring all of these measurements when a lot of it is reliant on models? And while it's challenging when you have these different viewpoints, it was really useful, and it sort of forced us to pressure test all the requirements in the protocol and to make sure that for every measurement that we're requiring, there's a good justification and use for it. And then finally, every protocol has a 30-day public consultation period where anyone can comment on the protocol online. So that's the last review piece and opportunity for feedback. And once we address all the comments from public consultation, which are also published online alongside with the protocol, that's when we consider the protocol officially certified and ready for use. But of course, the protocol is always going to evolve, so it doesn't just end after it's been certified. What we have is version 1.0, but we'll keep updating it in the future with scientific advances.
Yeah, I think that's particularly gnarly seen as you sort of described this battle between what is implementable, right, for a market versus what are all the things we could be doing. And if there's no sort of clear consensus, maybe there's an early consensus, and the step-by-step improvement process is going to be very crucial, I think.
So you outlined the process, I thought, really well. One thing I was curious about is, was there specific interface with suppliers and buyers, or contemplated suppliers and buyers, given the fact that ultimately, right, that's the shot on goal for these standards. What was that process, if any?
Yes, I can talk a little bit about this because it's a really great question to ask about how we might work with suppliers and buyers more generally as well, because suppliers and buyers are, of course, both like very important stakeholders for us. And as Jing mentioned earlier, we have a buyer paid business model. So in that way, we have as far as possible like aligned our incentives with buyers to issue rigorous high quality credits. Like that's what we and the buyer both want. And a buyer is essentially buying a promise when they purchase carbon removal. Like that's the way we kind of think about it. There's no direct visible output of the thing they paid for them to kind of get hold of. So having an independent body with the right technical expertise, so that's us, confirm the removal actually happened is critical. Like it's not a nice to have, but actually a core part of what it is they're purchasing. And ultimately, our role and the whole reason for our existence is to create that trust for the buyer. And that's why we get paid for by buyers, not suppliers. And I guess we've, therefore deliberately kind of avoided the financial entanglement with suppliers during that process. But of course, to do our work credibly, and this kind of comes back to the piece of like, how did we engage with these folks during the protocol development process, we have to work really closely with suppliers who the buyers we work for are buying from. Like that's a really important relationship. So we set our bar as an independent science team. Like Jing said, we did this kind of initial drafting and like thorough review of what was going on. But also we need to bear in mind that suppliers have a really important perspective to add on the operational feasibility and like optimization trade-offs associated with MRV and like doing the science on the ground. Like we're not the ones doing the OAE projects, the suppliers are. So the input from suppliers on these real world conditions are really important for us. So for example, Planetary Technologies have been really helpful in our protocol development process. We've been engaged with Planetary long before we knew we were going to work on our own OAE protocol. They are a clear leader in ocean alkalinity enhancement, and they put out the first kind of MRV protocol into the world for their process. It was open source and available for feedback. And then we've put out subsequently our protocol, which is like the first kind of third party registry authored protocol for OAE. So they definitely knew and understood the necessity and value of robust and rigorous MRV and getting transparent feedback on that work too. And their early work really helped us to start driving down our own development. And they gave us feedback during the private and public consultation stages that Jing's kind of outlined. Specifically we call out as well, they had some really useful lessons from community engagement and their early deployments that helped us understand permitting and regulatory structures much better. And it's just to kind of come back to it as well, it's really hard to write a protocol for something you haven't done yourself. So the practical experience that they were able to tell us about was really invaluable. And I hope that's meant that our protocol has just continued to improve in quality the more feedback we got from those kind of parties. And we did talk to some other suppliers who we've not worked quite as closely with as well, like during those kind of public consultation phases as well, to continue getting that really useful feedback. And Planetary as well is super collaborative. They're working with lots of academic groups, particularly like Dalhousie University, to advance the field, especially as they learn from deployments. So I think I would call out as well, there's kind of this really nice synergy between like the public, the academic kind of sphere and the more like private sector actors looking to do this work. And I think that's something that we look to emulate as well, like making sure that we engage along those lines too.
Okay. So obviously in the MRV process, an important part is assessing sequestration potential, but it's also important, especially I think for a lot of these ocean-based approaches, to assess potential risk, right? Both in terms of public concerns and just in general in terms of protecting the ecosystems. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about how risk assessment was carried out in the context of the OAE process, and what you learned from that process in the context of OAE.
Sure. So I guess the science of OEE, like it's true that we're currently at like a relatively early stage of research for ocean alkalinity enhancement. And there are potentially some unknown impacts of ocean alkalinity enhancement on the marine environment. For example, like biological organisms like plankton or higher trophic levels. And just a kind of personal note on this as well, like I did a PhD looking at the response of calcifying plankton to ocean alkalinity enhancement. So I've worked on biological responses of organisms to OEE for a little while. And as an oceanographer, I really care about what happens to the ocean. I know that's the case for all of us on the marine team at Isometric. So we have this like academic background, and genuine passion and care for the ocean, and like this really deep understanding of the potential the ocean has for helping us to reach climate goals as well. So I guess we think about this in the way that if we don't learn by doing field trials and deployments now, because we don't have this like really well established database of these impacts yet. And the only way to learn about what the impacts could be is by carrying out like small scale field trials, deployments to kind of build that knowledge base. And if we don't start to learn by doing those now, then it's going to be too late to know whether this is a safe, effective, and durable solution to carry out and help us to achieve those climate goals. So what we've aimed for with the protocol and how we think about risk is to put safe structures in place in the absence of regulation right now to ensure that these projects can tell us whether OAE is a viable CDR solution long term. So I guess having a protocol doesn't mean we think that this is a technique that should be deployed at a huge scale immediately. It means we have something rigorous in place that allows us to learn as much as possible as folks are starting to do these deployments. Because if you don't do proper MRV, then you're not going to learn anything. So that's kind of how we're thinking about generally like approaching risk in that sense. And I would call out as well, there's some potential like co-benefits of restoring the ocean to its pre-acidification state. And I say there could be some potential both co-benefits because I guess there's still some debate as to whether it's well proven there would be co-benefits from OAE, but I think there's signs of early emerging consensus in the literature and from kind of early field trials that have been carried out that on a local level, close to alkalinity discharge locations, there could be a high chance of locally mitigating ocean acidification. So I guess my philosophy on this and the way I think about it is that the environmental risks of doing nothing and allowing ocean acidification and global warming to continue are already known, and they're already known to be detrimental. So if project proponents make sure to operate within safe permitting limits, mitigate risks up front and monitor for any impacts, and have triggers for stopping deployments, like that's the key thing as well. Like that's something that we've had built into our protocol and we require that. We hope we set up a responsible framework for companies looking to carry out these OEE deployments in the early stages. And we do require all proponents to have an active permit set by local environmental authorities, which means experts at a local level decide on those safe thresholds for alkalinity and pH for those projects to operate in. So in the same way that like a desalination or other coastal discharge project might. And it's been really exciting as well to see like a dedicated pathway for permitting for marine carbon removal being developed in the US by the EPA as well.
Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit more about what some of those triggers might be, just examples?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'd call out a couple of specific examples from our protocol. So we have some recommended limits that people should think about for safe pH thresholds, but we definitely would defer to local like knowledge on what those permits should be. Like we as Isometric can't we don't have the right levels of local knowledge like sat within our team to say exactly what those should look like, but we do call out particular literature examples of like a lower than 1,000 micromole per kilogram alkalinity increase, for example, like that's been established in the literature, or potentially a kind of threshold of around pH 9, but we don't prescribe that because we don't think that would be appropriate. We don't know like the exact conditions of every single condition that might kind of be happening under these deployments. So that's like a kind of general example of how we would approach this. So yeah, Jing or Jen, feel free to jump in with any other examples you might want to highlight too. But I think that's probably like a good summary of how we would generally approach this. And I point folks towards specific examples that they can find in the protocol themselves as well.
Yeah, I can jump in quickly to just add that projects are required to have an adaptive management plan in place. So once they have those thresholds that are set by the local conditions and project specifics, let's say it's pH less than 9, for example. It could be something else, but they have to constantly monitor that. And then if for whatever reason that threshold is exceeded, then there must be plans in place to respond to that. So it could be like stopping the dosing for a bit while they figure out why the threshold was exceeded, and to fix it, for instance.
So I want to come back to a point you made, Sophie, which was almost actually a little bit new to me, and I find it incredibly important to highlight, which is that you said that with this protocol, you don't intend to sort of send a signal to say OAE is sort of definitely safe and definitely scalable, and we should definitely deploy it sort of with many different companies. You instead said that you want to create a regulatory, or in the absence of regulatory clarity, you intend to create a rule book that helps conduct the field trials that are so urgently needed to advance our learning, which obviously from a carbon disease standpoint, I am fully on board with. That's all. That's what we're so focused on. But can you tell us a little bit more about that? I want to stress on this point because you are a for-profit company. You have an incentive, obviously, that more buyers buy more credits from more suppliers. So how do you ensure that that is your goal and that is your rule sort of by which you operate?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I guess we definitely think that this is something that could be applicable to early stage field trials as well as like early deployments. And realistically, marine carbon removal companies are going to be operating at relatively small scales to begin with, because it's going to take time to ramp up those technologies because they're at a relatively early technology readiness stage. I actually think we were chatting about this aspect of what we do as a team the other day, which is super cool. And I think Jen actually really hit the nail on the head with how she was talking about this. So I'm actually going to invite Jen to share what we were chatting about just the other day between the three of us. And maybe we can all pitch in as well with some of our thoughts after that.
Yeah, sure. Happy to jump in. I would say as a collective, we are working towards climate change solutions. And for the greater solution space, we need clarity on the viability of all CDR pathways. And the only way we'll know this is by trying it in real life. So I like to view our protocol as a market signal that OAE is a promising solution. It has a strong scientific foundation, and it's been demonstrated theoretically and in experimental settings. And now we know that these pathways have the potential to be net negative and the potential to scale, but there are uncertainties on the efficiency of these processes and potential nonlinear feedbacks as they are deployed in real life. And so this is even more reason why we need to start rigorous accounting and MRV now, while these projects are at their pilot scale, so that we can build the muscle memory that is needed for these technologies to scale. I should also say that our protocol is setting a pretty high bar, and it's not easy for it to be complied with. So some suppliers might be working at too early or too small of a scale for it to be worthwhile to seek out credits. And maybe those suppliers aren't ready to comply with our protocol yet. And that's also okay. So in terms of signaling, I think that our protocol is like signaling a potential and a readiness to really try this in the real world. I also think that in terms of content, we're signaling what the scientific state is at right now for what high confidence in quantification for OAE might entail. And then finally, on that point on incentives being misaligned with ultimately, like Isometric only succeeds if CDR as an entire industry succeeds. And part of that is if OAE can become a viable and scalable solution. I would say that we are fortunate to be working across multiple CDR pathways. And so we aren't fully dependent on any one pathway being successful. And it is likely that we will find through CDR work as an industry some pathways to be more efficient or some pathways to be more promising. However, like we do need a portfolio of solutions to tackle such a big problem with climate change. And so I guess we've reduced the dependency there, but are still broadly interested in all CDR pathways and exploring them.
Great. Yeah, I think that's really interesting to hear. Will, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. So let me play the role of the cynic here. As you said, Jen, right? It's going to be a high bar for a lot of suppliers to comply with this kind of protocol. What would keep most buyers from just saying, "Look, the general public's not going to understand the difference between the stringency of different protocols, right? And we're trying to get credits to meet net zero as quickly as possible and as cheaply as possible. And so we're just going to go to somebody else who's going to make that easier for us. And the market's not going to understand. The public's not going to understand. Banks, investors aren't really going to care as long as it's being facilitated. Does that mean that your model may not be viable from a business perspective?
Yeah, I would definitely say right now at the state with the voluntary carbon market, our high quality work definitely serves a more sophisticated buyer who is interested in that due diligence and is really motivated to, I guess, not be greenwashing. And ultimately, I think a lot of that accountability falls on the public, once again, on corporations not wanting to be greenwashing, at least in the voluntary carbon market. I think that'll certainly be different in a compliance market when regulation steps in. But that is certainly, I guess, a threat to Isometric's way of working, which is just people that don't care enough about doing the due diligence. Jing, do you want to add some thoughts?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Jen said on the greenwashing bit, I feel like there is extra scrutiny right now on companies and like carefully watching them to see if they are greenwashing. And even though, like Will, you said, maybe the general public, they're not going to dig into the weeds of a particular protocol or like check to see, or maybe they can't understand exactly what the quality bar is, but it just takes like one investigative journalist to write an article to expose a company. So that is a risk. So like maybe they can get away with low quality credits for a while, but it may just be a matter of time before word gets out.
I would also just add that, what we were talking about earlier in the episode, because of the faults and the errors we've seen in the legacy carbon market, there is, as we've seen in other CDR pathways already, this like quest and urge for cross-registry, industry-wide rules of the game to be laid out, which one and some people also do call a standard. So, for example, Cascade Climate has obviously worked on this for enhanced rock weathering. And to both of your points, I think the community is urging for some form of a rule book that is ideally provided by a regulator, but is so difficult to provide at the moment because there is so much uncertainty that all of the registries by law have to abide by, or even just by sort of community and public push have to abide by, such that there is a minimal bar that everybody has to abide to that is still so high that there's no risks associated to it. But I also want to make sure we don't get too stuck on the rules of the game in the carbon markets, unless one of you wants to add something, Sophie, I think.
Well, I was just going to add very briefly, would totally agree with you that we would welcome any opportunity to align with high quality, within the market, because as you would suggest, that's incredibly, incredibly important. So like, for example, I know there are efforts underway to think about like good data standards for like marine carbon removal along those lines. And that would be like really exciting for us to be able to like align with folks who are also looking to set in place like independent standards about how marine carbon removal can be conducted. So absolutely. And we also like cite in our protocol, for example, like the Aspen Code of Conduct for ethical marine carbon removal research, and also like the OAE best practices guide. So we absolutely want to align with like folks who are doing great work in those areas. And I should note as well, just on to go back to the point about kind of why would buyers want to buy high quality carbon removal? Like, we are definitely seeing that people do want to do this because of the threats to people's reputation of buying something that isn't good quality. So we are seeing like significant signal that people do want to invest in this. But at the same time, like, it is this kind of like first wave of buyers who are very sophisticated. And I do get what you're saying about like potentially further down the line where folks might not necessarily have like due diligence teams built out on their stuff. Like, that is something that we have to think about. But to Jing's point, I do think that just having the transparency in place is a huge deterrent to like buying stuff that is not good quality. And I think that's really what we see as like a central tenet of what we do at Isometric, is making sure that if someone wants to come and see what we have done, like, it's all there. You can go and look at it. And we hope that that's like something that's going to help to drive like quality up and kind of rebuild this trust in what a carbon credit can do. And then we'd obviously welcome then like when a compliance market is coming in, because that will again help to set like much better standards for how this stuff should operate. But yeah, so just kind of wanted to add that to the conversation, because I think it's an important perspective to bear in mind.
Yeah, totally. I think it's so amazing. To me personally, I find it fascinating that rules are so exciting to me. When I think about this process, it's like you can really hijack and you can really sort of optimize the system on both ends. And it's so exciting and sort of innovative to think about, okay, which incentive structure, which sort of function needs to be in place for this to properly work out. And I want to just briefly talk about one last function that personally I think we talk a little bit too little about in this MCDR community and MRV conversation. Actually, like, this idea of MRV is to a degree a little bit misleading, because it sort of describes so many structurally different activities. So the measurement of oceanographic parameters is very different from the activity of who and when and where verifies that data. So I want to stress a little bit on this piece of the verification. In the absence of rules that are laid out or prescribed by an official authority, what is verification? Like, who says that the rule or the protocol and the model and the set of measurements that you laid out in your protocol is actually scientifically robust? And do we even have enough people with the right expertise in the oceanographic context to go into a project design document, into a supplier's activity, and say, this probably very bespoke method and implementation of our protocol ticks the box of being good enough? Who does that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up, Anna, because I share the same frustration with you, where we so often hear the letters MRV said together, but in reality, it's actually impossible for any single organization to do MRV by themselves.
Yes,
like
100%. Yeah.
By definition, the people who are doing the monitoring, measuring the data, reporting it, they like have to be separate from whoever is doing the verification, so that you're never grading your own test. As for how we do verification, so we have the OAE protocol, for example, as the overarching rule book that projects need to abide by in order to have credits listed on the Isometric registry. So project developers submit a project design document, or PDD, there's many acronyms, and that describes how their specific OAE project will adhere to the protocol. And then the project developers collect their data, or they could enlist the help of third-party monitoring or measurement companies to help make those necessary measurements. And that data gets reported to Isometric. So in order to do the verification, Isometric works with certified third-party validation and verification bodies, or commonly known as VVBs. Sorry, another acronym. But the VVBs, they check that the project design document adheres to all the requirements set out in the protocol, but they also do a lot more. So they check the data and calculations, they conduct a site visit, and it's typically a pretty thorough verification. So for example, the VVBs might check the instrument calibrations and that they're most up to date. They will sometimes rerun the carbon removal calculations to ensure that the net CDR numbers are correct. And there are a number of VVBs that we work with. They typically have a lot of expertise on the carbon accounting and life cycle analysis side, which is really important for every CDR project, including OAE. But there are definitely aspects of the OAE protocol that require more scientific judgment and subject matter expertise. So, for example, assessing if an ocean model is sufficiently skillful for the task of quantifying the net air-sea CO2 drawdown. And for these parts of the verification, the VVB or Isometric will need to subcontract out an ocean subject matter expert to help out. And so this might be an ocean modeling scientist in academia or someone from an environmental consulting firm who has a necessary oceanographic background. And if we are to really scale CDR, or if we really are to scale OAE in particular, there'll definitely be an increased need for these types of subject matter experts who have the necessary expertise to verify these projects. I actually think that this is a really exciting time to be an ocean scientist because there's a growing number of different career paths available, but thinking carefully about how we sort of also scale the CDR workforce is going to be another important factor.
Yeah. I need to be careful not to nerd out too much on this topic. I could talk about it forever, but I want to make sure, I think that's a great explanation. Thank you, Jing. It needs more attention is my point. I want to make sure that we go into the science, and I applaud all those who have made it through the rules of the game. We're gonna talk a little bit more about some specific scientific aspects, and I want to highlight in particular the environmental sort of resistance and or skepticism, understandably so, around OAE. And I'm going to try my best to sort of briefly summarize how I interpret what the protocol currently does on sort of environmental monitoring. To my understanding, it's actually also important to sort of differentiate between what you're measuring for the quantification of CDR, the quantification of carbon removal, versus your environmental monitoring of parameters that ensure sort of regulatory compliance, that ensure environmental safeguards that are used to sort of uphold the thresholds, the trigger points that you mentioned in the beginning. In the sort of list of measurements that are required to do according to Isometric, there are, especially on the chemical and physical side, obvious required measurements, and then there are primarily recommended biological, ecological measurements. And to some degree, this is sort of a symptom of the technical availabilities, I would say, of even conducting these measurements. But it's also, I think, a symptom of just much, much more uncertainty around the biological and ecological impacts of OAE. First of all, how do you even determine what should go into that protocol versus what shouldn't? And how do you navigate this space when it's so difficult, as you mentioned, to sort of set rules about what suppliers can or cannot do? And how do you sort of defend that a lot of the biological, ecological measurement side is only recommended, and how long is that only going to be recommended, I guess, is the question here. Tell us more about that sort of scientific urgency and uncertainty.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Anna. So I want to start by just sharing our overall thinking on biological and ecological monitoring, and then kind of go into specifically the requirements in the protocol. So our goal as a registry is to bring innovation and expertise in the quantification of carbon removal. And we also need to acknowledge that we live on one planet, so these projects aren't happening in isolation and they don't impact carbon alone. They also are impacting biodiversity, other aspects of the environment, and there's the human element of these projects too. So our goal is to set a minimum bar for environmental and social safeguarding for projects so that buyers can be sure that projects listed with Isometric follow the best practices for responsible deployment. I'm glad you bring up that it's difficult to have a one-size-fits-all answer, and that's in a large part of why biological and ecological monitoring is kind of listed as recommended. The list of monitoring requirements is the common set of requirements for all projects that we're comfortable saying, like, this is explicitly what you need to do. And in many cases, environmental and biological monitoring would be deemed required based on a site and project specific assessment. Furthermore, going deeper into the one-size-fits-all piece, not only are projects and sites different, which require a different treatment of risks, but every place also has its unique history and culture. For example, like the history of exploitation or distrust in the US is quite pronounced. And so we also view our take on environmental and social safeguarding as wanting to give guidance on best practices, but also having trust in local communities and knowing how to best take care of their environment and human health, rather than trying to tip power away from those local decision makers. So we really prioritize requiring that a certain process is followed, such as including stakeholder input, doing a thorough risk assessment and having a mitigation plan, and standards for environmental impact assessment. But ultimately, in many ways, we defer to permits that are granted by local regulatory bodies. Now, the marine environment is also a particularly interesting space because it's even more connected than, say, terrestrial interventions. And it's important to recognize that the actions that occur in one place in the ocean can have farther reaching impacts spatially and temporally beyond that project scale. And at the same time, it makes it really important for us to monitor those impacts, but it also makes it really difficult to monitor and then attribute those impacts to specific activities. And furthermore, the ocean is a changing baseline, and it's changing because of climate change. As Sophie mentioned earlier, there's already a risk of doing nothing. And we have many factors that are negatively impacting ocean health and threatening aquatic life, such as warming temperatures, acidification, increased prevalence of marine diseases, ecological and marine shifts, and mass mortalities. And these factors make it really difficult to establish a baseline or the scenario that would have happened in the absence of a marine CDR project. And so for all of those reasons, it makes it really difficult to take biological and ecological data and like specifically compare it to something and verify that. Now, in terms of what we require in our protocols, I want to, before the ecological and biological monitoring, which is already in the ocean, we do a lot of proactive safeguarding too. So that's in terms of threshold limits and also through thorough characterization of feedstock. So anything that's discharged into the marine environment is well known and well characterized. And for listeners that are interested, definitely I feel free to check out the feedstock characterization module that's listed on our registry. And this is really important because it's something that we can control before anything is added to the ocean. Now, in terms of the biological and ecological monitoring, we strongly recommend collecting biological and ecological samples to establish a site-specific time series. And like I mentioned before, after a site and project-specific risk assessment, it's likely that ecological or biological measurements will be deemed necessary, and the specific type, the specific species of interest, the specific methods used will be established based on the specifics of the site. I also want to highlight that there is a body of literature on biological and ecological impacts to perturbed carbonate chemistry in the ocean. And these can be really useful to help steer us in identifying potential risks and impacts from OAE. However, the real-world impact of OAE is something we actually need to observe in practice, and is another reason why we want to be doing these projects with rigorous MRV in earnest. And because of the stated challenges with difficulty with baseline and attribution, interpretation of biological and ecological data remains a scientific question, and is why we need to make sure that scientists stay engaged with OAE. And it's also why we need to ensure that we have adaptive management plans in place so that projects can be stopped if unintended consequences arise and become known. So right now, we work with projects that are operating at a very small scale and are not necessarily operating continuously. But over time, as projects get larger, the impact of OAE is likely to be more pronounced. And so stockpiling data now so that we have a record of changes from before, during, and after the scale-up of OAE operations is super important. And it'll be essential for learning more about the overall impacts of OAE deployment at scale. It's also, I think, not out of the question that OAE can provide a remediation effect. In fact, this is something that's currently being studied. For example, with combating ocean acidification for the Great Barrier Reef, for example. And I think we could see activities like OAE actually being welcomed and desired by communities in the future because of the environmental co-benefits.
Okay, so let's talk about a couple of policy questions. So there are members of the CDR community, including Carbon 180, if I can speak for them in this context, that argue that MRV should also include assessment of issues such as social justice and equity considerations. Do you agree that those should be components of an MRV process?
Yeah, so I can talk about this a little bit, and I think we've covered quite a lot already, actually, about how we would approach this specific question so far. But I think to kind of summarize, we can all agree on the utmost importance of social license to operate for carbon dioxide removal, and the things that you've mentioned there, Will, are absolutely crucial for that. And I think that social license to operate is the same for CDR as with any new industry, and a range of factors need to be considered really carefully as part of that social license. So environmental impacts, social impacts of projects on local communities where carbon dioxide removal projects might be deployed, etc. And on the kind of flip side as well, I'm definitely aware that some folks would say as a registry, we should only do carbon accounting. So we should not consider any of the environmental and social safeguarding piece at all. So there's depending on who you speak to, there's actually this quite wide spectrum of where people sit. So I think that's also very interesting about how the dynamics playing out in the debate on this right now. But as outlined earlier already, we see that environmental and social safeguarding piece is a really crucial element for us to include as a minimum bar in our protocols. And we think that's as a registry, almost a duty of care thing to make sure we're only issuing credits for environmentally and socially conscious projects.
All right. So you've alluded before to the interface between voluntary carbon markets and what I see now as an emerging regulatory environment in the context of MCDR. I'm curious how Isometric has interacted with the regulatory environment, and if you think some of the standards that you're developing here ultimately could be incorporated into that emerging regulatory market.
Yeah, again, super cool question. And I'm going to do my best to represent this because Should note we're all scientists on this call, not like policy experts, but obviously we have a lot of exposure to what's going on, like because we work kind of deeply in this area and everybody is so interconnected. And I personally have like had quite a lot of interaction with policy folks on these kind of things. So I'll do my best to represent it. So I guess broadly, like even just outside of the context of just marine carbon removal, like regulators and governments are developing methodologies specific to pathways. Like that's happening. Like you say, there's this kind of emerging regulatory environment. And I would say broadly, the current focus of those regulators has been on DAC, so direct air capture, and BECCS, so bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And we are, as a registry, are hoping and expecting that this will broaden over time, because we obviously work with like a broader suite of novel carbon removal techniques. And I think overall, by setting rigorous protocols for marine carbon dioxide removal now, we expect that it will help to demystify this areas for regulators. Because I guess particularly the marine space, like it's not something that typically sees like a high level of internal knowledge in the kind of policymaking environment in some contexts. And we're hoping that this like potentially could provide a model for those regulators to work with. And what we expect a regulator would set as well as generally more like a high level policy framework for how this stuff could work. And our protocol would then be like a more prescriptive implementation of that high level framework. And to give a more concrete example, like I think, as a registry, like we're thinking very much about the project level implementation of how these projects are going to work and how MRV is going to work. Whereas a kind of more like national level where policymakers might be thinking about, or even kind of international level, you know, we're thinking about carbon budgets on a much broader scale. So I think that's kind of where we see our protocols like fitting into that broad system of like how people are thinking about carbon accounting allocation.
Okay. So I think this is related to that, but what do you view the policy levers that could ultimately help facilitate Isometric's work, and those that might prove as challenges or barriers to that?
Yeah. So generally, we think regulation of carbon dioxide removal is crucially important. And marine carbon dioxide removal is no exception. So we need governments to make judgment calls about what classifies as high quality carbon removal, and then oversee the work of third parties like us, Isometric, who provide the more detailed assurance on these like project level activities. So this is actually what's happening in Europe with the CRCF, so carbon removal and carbon farming. For example, they set a minimum threshold of 200-year durability for carbon removal credits to be issued. And they also created a regulatory framework that authorizes and oversees bodies such as Isometric, so registries more broadly. And it's also, I would call out, particularly important that processes like the London Protocol negotiations like properly account for marine carbon removal, and establish frameworks that allow it to take place in a safe way.
Yeah, I think on all of these topics we covered, we could spend so much more time, right? I find it incredibly exciting and daunting and innovative and challenging to think about the work that you've done, which is to sort of take this huge body of scientific, operational, financial uncertainty in the market and try to sort of develop a implementable, actionable plan that needs to obviously improve over time, given that the science is still sort of coming in. But from what sort of you shared today, I can only imagine. I mean, I'm an engineer, so it comes, I guess it's more like logical for me to sometimes think in rules. But as scientists, I feel like it's in this entire field, it's sort of a new challenge to not think about sort of every unsolved question, but think about the things we do know that we can implement. And I bet it was quite a shift sort of from coming from a PhD in university, and omit a very specific scientific question and rather think about this sort of implementation of science. I bet it was exciting while challenging.
Yeah, for sure. Like thinking more on like a kind of systems level rather than, like you say, kind of, I don't know, I spent my time thinking about very specific, like for me, species of coccolithophore that were going to respond to ocean alkalinity enhancement, which obviously for our protocol, like while I would have loved to, I couldn't build out a framework for like every single species that might respond, for example. But yeah, curious on like other folks' thoughts on this particular point, because yeah, I think the way that we work at Isometric is really unique, and I find it really exciting working here. So yeah, curious on Jing and Jen's thoughts as well on how we work.
Sure. Yeah, I think in my own experience, I would say that working at Isometric as a scientist has allowed me to work on very applied and interdisciplinary projects. But I also think that research and like science takes on many different, characters. So I know of various people who work on very applied and interdisciplinary PhD projects as well, and get to do a lot of in coordinating across both like basic science and sort of the implementation. So I think the common thread has just been being able to use like first principles thinking and the scientific method, and staying engaged with the process of knowledge generation and sharing, which is really awesome. That is something that I think there's a growing industry for ocean scientists to do with marine CDR.
Yeah, I wonder whether, Jing, you want to talk a little bit about the research collaboration side of this as well, because Jing actually leads on one of our like really exciting research collaborations, which is like, yeah, a really important part of, I would say, being a scientist at Isometric too.
Yeah, I'll just say one really exciting aspect of our job is just the amount of engagement and collaboration that we have with scientists all over the space. Because CDR is such an interdisciplinary problem, we have really exciting wide range of expertise on our internal team spanning terrestrial and marine pathways, but Isometric has also built out a community of over 200 scientists. I forget the exact number we're at now in our, what we call the Science Network, who are folks that sign up with relevant expertise to CDR that we can engage with in various ways. So, for instance, members of the Science Network can do some paid consulting with Isometric on specific projects or protocols, especially in areas where we don't have necessarily the right expertise, just because it's impossible for any one person to know everything. Members of the Science Network also get invited to events such as the Ocean Sciences workshop that we had on the OE protocol. They help provide feedback during public consultations. And then also very exciting is that we can collaborate with them on research proposals. So just as a few examples, so Sophie mentioned, we're industry partners on this ARPA-E project that's led by Seaworthy to develop open source software tools to support ocean biogeochemical modeling for MRV of marine CDR projects. Also on the terrestrial side, we have some scientists at Isometric involved in a DOE project led by the National Renewable Energy Lab to develop MRV frameworks for biomass CDR projects. So we're definitely very excited to still stay engaged and attending conferences and just interacting with scientists.
Yeah, and to Sophie's point, someone must study the responsive coccolith force.
Yes.
So that we have more clarity on the ecological impacts, etc. Yeah, but this is definitely an exercise in sort of training our muscles and learning by doing, and sort of living in the realm of uncertainty while optimizing for certainty, I suppose, is my way of wrapping this up. I don't know, Will, if you want to add something.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's important for people to understand that iterative process is critical and is happening in our field. It'll help to build trust.
We hope so. We're looking forward to sharing with the community what we learned from the first verifications against this protocol as well, which are upcoming. So yeah, stay tuned.
Awesome. It was great to have all three of you here. That was awesome. Thank you for taking us through the rulebook and sharing your process, and hope we learn more. And in the next year, we'll have a more sophisticated, clearer, better protocol on all accounts. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks, everyone.